over to you, and I will shut my video, and I'm gonna unmute myself. So over to you.
Okay, am I live there, John? You can hear me okay?
Yes.
So I guess the question is, I guess I am.
Yep.
So greetings and welcome back, everyone. You can see our topic here today is about blueprints and sign-offs from professional architects and engineers. And I guess the question is, do I really need an architect or an engineer? Sorry, I had to kill my phone. Okay, so do I need an engineer, an architect, or actually do I need both to complete the blueprints and submit the design package to the municipality or perhaps your local building authority for a permit for building approval? So let's consider what this question we really need to think about and hopefully clear up because there can be some confusion. Most often, it is primarily used to certify documents that are complete and ready for construction contracts. Also for permit applications, and at times post-construction certification. In other words, completion or substantial completion. But let's take a look at the various details and information regarding sign-off and drawings stamped by architects and engineers. So just a few of the learning objectives we hope to accomplish today is listed here. So analyze responsibility when design professionals sign off on a project and drawings and documents. Evaluate circumstances to meet this professional requirement. Manage the seal, so the sealing and or signature on construction plans and documents. And describe how can this process possibly influence First Nation project practices. And also to verify when the requirements is intended to authenticate is genuineness or authenticity only to the recipient. So sign-offs are often the result of project construction finalization stage I indicated earlier, where a certificate of occupancy, such as a C of O, is required. However, it may also indicate that further evidence is required for obtaining the building permit, again, as I mentioned before. It is possible that your province, territory, or community or local building department will require, for example, even house plans to be stamped or sealed by an architect or an engineer. Perhaps not. There are legal guidelines dictating which projects need an architect's involvement and sign off, and others that can be reviewed and stamped also by an engineer. Typically, most every large project, particularly when it comes to occupancy in assembly type categories, requires an architect or an engineer to sign off on the construction drawings. Well, as I indicated, what's the purpose? So if we take a look at it, the final drawings and specifications together should form a complete and detailed description of the total project. From a compliance perspective, intended to provide public safety with regards to certainly safety, human safety, occupant safety, and comply with building codes and provide structural integrity. Primarily off reserve, municipalities required to have professional sign-offs by an architect or an engineer. Thus, drawings and specifications become an important part of a legal agreement for this purpose. Equally so, most every municipality requires them to be professionally stamped. So it gets back to the question, do I really need an architect or an engineer? Well, what I'm going to present to you is, yes, we do, but at the same time, there are a few other options we need to think about. So when we start talking about sign-offs, sign-off must include the professional signature and either registration or membership number or some type of official stamp or seal. Some other requirements that may need to be considered is certainly the architect or engineer or the professional must carry professional liability insurance. In other words, errors in omission insurance, unless undertaking work on behalf of their employer. And then it would be assumed that they would hopefully be protected under the employer's we'll call it insurance. So when we take a look at this particular slide, you can see kind of in the background sort of a site plan design and the word draft stamped on it. So when I see something like that, what I'm really thinking about is this is something in the preliminary stage that is really not a sign-off, but certainly an indication to whoever that's viewing this or receiving this. This is really just a draft only. It's not a stamped, sealed document by an architect or an engineer. It could be a drawing or a schematic sketch, as a matter of fact, as it could be put together from an architect or an engineer, but certainly in this case, it's clearly marked as a draft. So when we talk about this by sealing technical documents such as drawings and specification, it really certifies that the work was prepared with the Architects and Engineers Regulations Act. Both of them have their own specific regulations and certainly covered under their particular acts. We also have to think about the seal is not a guarantee by that architect or engineer of a successful outcome of a project, since the outcome in part depends on many factors beyond the control of the architect or the engineer. So the seal should not be considered a certification mark or warranty of correctness, but as I indicated, the indication of the draft is just something in the progress stage, which is not finalized or complete at this particular stage. Before I go a little bit further, let's cover a few definitions. So when we see the construction document, written in graphic documents prepared by an architect or engineer communicating the project design for construction and administration of the contract. When we look at the actual contract document, as opposed to construction documents, it's legally enforceable requirements that are part of a contract when the agreement is finalized. We're also going to be talking about that word completion, deemed completion, substantial completion, and tying into it later, getting or obtaining the certificate of occupancy. So a contract shall be deemed to be complete and services or materials shall be deemed to be last supplied to the improvement when the price of the completion, correction of a known defect, or last supply is not more than lesser of 1% of the contract price, or B, $1,000. So the deemed completion guide is to project for a project closeout, and this is basically taken from the Ontario Association of Architects as an example. And certainly there would be other examples, for example, with different architectural associations across the country, and also with engineers. But this gives us one sort of general definition of what is deemed completion. Often this question might come up: what is considered substantial and or the actual finish or deemed completion? I wanted to touch a little bit about drawings and specifications. We'll be talking about them in more detail. In fact, I will be talking about in more detail in some upcoming webinars. But I just wanted to kind of touch on drawings and specs are used in many ways by different participants throughout the project. Probably many of you realize that. But for example, when we take a look at drawings and specs provide a design package for a number of different people. Well, the owner, the client, the builder, the subtrades, but equally as important in most locations, particularly to obtain a building permit. And that's assuming where building permits do apply. But I know for off reservation, I would say for the majority of all projects that involve drawings and specs, especially by architects and engineers, is to obtain the building permit. So drawings and specifications, as we can see here, offer a number of different features. So they form the construction documents, they provide the contractual roadmap for the contractor, they define the requirements of the work, they become legally enforceable components of a contract for the build or construction. And certainly they are used in the early stages to bid or negotiate on obtaining the work from the, we'll call it the contractor's perspective. I'm not going to go through the whole slide here, but the drawing package typically includes quite a few different types of drawings. And as we can see here, everything from the foundation up to the roof. So in other words, how can we basically describe and illustrate in a drawing package what needs to be done on any particular build. Getting down to even things such as the schedules. So door and window schedules, so the types of doors and windows, and even the finishing. And of course, equally as important are the building service plans. So for example, the building services such as the plumbing, heating, electrical, and so on. So drawing properties and thinking about sign-offs. So when we talk about drawing properties and sign-offs, I want you to think about all the drawing properties must be reviewed and approved prior to the official release. And certainly this puts a lot of responsibility on the, we'll call it on the backs or into the hands of the architect and or the engineer. So otherwise, they most often would be considered in draft form only, as I indicated earlier, with the word draft stamped usually across the drawings. Another thing we used to use in the architectural engineering field is certainly each drawing in release would be dated. So there's a sort of a trail of dates when drawings in documents would be submitted up to the final stage of finally we see the engineer or the architect stamp on the drawings, ready to bid on and to be released for construction. Well, there's a lot of things that the architect and engineer must look at. So I've listed some of them here, indicating the shape and size, identifying items by use of common drawing symbols. Certainly drawings indicate rooms and spaces, components and equipment, materials, assemblies and components, dimensions and sizes, details and diagrams and connections, and identify materials with some generic names. So for example, is it gypsum board or is it drywall? So again, the architect and engineer certainly has a lot of responsibility when it comes to the sign off and certainly putting a drawing or document package together to form a construction contract. So drawing and construction review, I kind of pose the question, who is holding the liability bag? And this is one of the questions that often pops up when it comes to the issue of, I guess, sign-offs. So when we talk about holding the liability bag, what if there's potential for design problems? How about non-compliance with code requirements that are not met? Again, architects and engineers only stamp their design in their construction documents. They're not totally responsible for the work that happens in the field. But yet, we'll find out later on, people may want to get early occupancy in a building or claim that the building has been substantially completed and they want to occupy or take over the building. So again, there's a lot of issues that arise out of the issue of certainly stamps, sealings, and sign-offs. So I get down to the point of what limitations may apply. So it really depends upon the contractual obligation of engagement between basically the architect and or engineer and certainly the owner. And certainly we can't leave the contractor out of this whole equation. But it also needs to think about things such as limitations. Is the owner going to directly supervise the project? Will it be supervised by the architect and or the engineer? Certainly, depending on the, we'll call it the knowledge base of the owner, it may be contracted out, or it may be assigned as part of the architect or engineer's, we'll call it contractual engagement terms. So this comes down to basically risk assessment. It also comes down to the agreement, as I indicated, between the architect and engineer and certainly the actual owner. If you're going to have oversight on the work, you have to be sure to have sufficient supervision to oversee the project to make sure it's done properly and according to drawings and the specifications. So the extent of the supervision must be defined by the scope of work, but not less than a reasonable standard, certainly for professional care. I want to talk a little bit next about project completion in the sign-off. When the contractor or builder has fulfilled all the requirements of the contract documents, the duties are at an end, other than the warranty conditions or other information that has to be handed back over to the owner. So the owner relies on the architect or engineer to determine completion or substantial completion on any project, unless they are doing it on their own. It often includes the architect or engineer's what they call punch lists. I like to call it the list of incomplete work or deficiencies. So when we take a look at it, what really is project closeout and project completion? Well, one of the fields of study is the project management body of knowledge. So according to a guide to the project management body of knowledge, also referred to as the PMBOK guide, the project closing process group consists of those processes performed to conclude all the activities across all the project management process groups. Again, I'm kind of talking about it from the project management point of view. But when we think about it, project management is part of sort of everyone's task in a way, be it the owner, the contractor, the architect, or the engineer. So when we start taking a look at it, it's to formally complete the project, the phase, or the contractual obligations. So when we see on this particular slide here, it's a combination when applied to the project that the assurance that all the work has been completed, assurance that all agreed upon project management process has been executed, so the management of the project, and a formal recognition of the completion of a project. In other words, everyone agrees that the work is complete. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the occupancy by the owner, because upon, we'll say, getting towards that finishing stage, I'm sure there's always a certain bit of anxiety, certainly to occupy this new building. So the occupants by the owner and the sign-off. So the owner is entitled to occupy the project work according to most contract documents, especially when we look at things such as the CCDC documents. But it may be only for the part of the project, or certain parts of the project, or perhaps all of the project. So then we're really boiling down to is what is considered substantially complete work. We saw earlier some amounts, such as a percentage or a dollar amount that could be assigned as a sign of substantial completion. Again, it can vary from province to province, location to location. So there's no fixed one uniform, we'll call it, definition to what is deemed substantially complete. So we also look at this may require an occupancy permit or the judgment by the architect or the engineer that the work is substantially complete. In other words, the architect or the engineer's sign off. I posted as an example off to the side, the City of Calgary, an application for occupancy. So as we can take a look at it, we see there's a part A, which is called the declaration, the information about the project, and part B, that it's a signature of the various authorities of what is deemed to be complete. So for example, the development, the plumbing and gas, the mechanical, it doesn't meet community standards, the fire department, the health services, electrical, and certainly the building department. So there could be a number of different sign-offs, certainly not just by the architect or engineer, but certainly by a number of other people. And again, variations do happen, as we know, because there are differences. And what I'm looking at, or what we are looking at, is for the City of Calgary. Certainly many other large municipalities and cities would have this type of document for the application for occupancy. And again, when we think about it, when we think about occupancy, even from the builder's perspective, it's all about safety. Can the building be safely occupied? And remember, if it's signed off by an architect or an engineer or any of these other people, there is a level of risk that is involved. So what does the law say? So when we start looking at it from the point of view of the law, the practice of architecture in Canada is governed by the Architects Act. Its purpose is to protect the public interest. The Act itself specifies the legal responsibilities for those who practice architecture, including their qualifications, their training, their professional conduct, their standards, including certainly things like standard of care, and certainly liability. When we look at the Engineers Act, basically is very, very similar. So similar requirements apply to the field of engineering. So we can see in this detailed outline version, and likewise for the engineering associations, professionals are responsible for maintaining and upholding their specific requirements. Both architects and engineers are licensed and regulated by their respective provincial associations. And to practice, the person must be a member in good standing. Certainly, that is also important. Well, when we take a look at it again from the perspective of building code, we see something a little bit different. So certain drawings for a commercial or public building may be performed by qualified technicians. Notice I use the word technicians as opposed to architect or engineer, but typically under the direction of an architect or an engineer. If we take a look at the building code and building structures, especially part 9, which is residential and smaller buildings, this also applies to some of those, but not necessarily for something like a house. So when we talk about the structural design portion, generally will require an engineer and likely a civil engineer when it comes to site servicing, or structural engineering when it comes to things such as structural design, such as specific steel or concrete design work. Well, we can't forget about the code requirements. So building codes provide the minimum requirements for health, safety, and structural sufficiency of any building and structure built, basically not just in Canada, but most parts of, we'll say, at least even North America, if not other countries. The code does not specify who can stamp or sign off on a building in order to obtain a building permit, but certainly the particular provincial acts do so. So buildings that are a few examples requiring sign-off services, as we can see here, are apartments that are residential, 5 or more dwelling. It may be different in some provinces. It may be 4 or more dwelling units. Hotels, commercial buildings, industrial buildings, one-story buildings over a specific size. So for example, over 600 square meters or roughly 6,000 square feet. Public assembly buildings, hospitals, and certainly schools. So again, these are things that need sign-offs, and particularly designed by architects or engineers. So there are times when the plans must be prepared and stamped or sealed by this professional engineer or architect, or in some case, both. If you're, for example, building an addition even larger than 600 square meters or 3 stories high, the Architects Act will fall into place along with building codes and basically imply these buildings must be basically retained through an architect or an engineer, and certainly stamped and sealed in the sign-offs by an architect and or engineer. When we talk about the engineering side of things, the other was primarily buildings. How about other services? So for example, a few examples on the engineering side of the sign-off discussion. The following are also mandatory for engineering practice. So we can see infrastructure such as roads and utilities, bridges and portable bridges, major culvert construction, retaining structures, and certainly things such as shoreline protection. So again, these are just a few of the many examples that apply to buildings and structures for engineers. Then we get down to multiple uses. A project sign-off sheet, therefore, is essentially to formally close a project or acknowledge the delivery of some key deliverables. But on the other side, there can be other requirements for sign-off, such as the agreement between the client, also known in some cases as the owner, and designer, or as a requirement to attain a building permit in some jurisdictions, or perhaps sign off at the completion or preliminary design stage of the project. Again, certainly the architect or engineer is going to look for a sign off and approval from the owner, especially when they're doing work for the owner. So again, another point of the sign off. So project sign off is one of many activities, not just at the end of the project. There are certainly other locations where a stamp or formal certification by design professionals required either upfront, such as at the start of a build, or simply during the issue of trying to even apply for the building permit. Or perhaps it doesn't even match the execution, so the architect or engineer may not want to sign off. So there could be some issues here depending on the smooth transition of work between the parties. We start talking about on some other considerations. So we start thinking about this. Other considerations for the use of a sign-off may include these items. So have the intended goals of the project been met? So things to think about. Were the actual deliverables delivered? And any comments, observations, or any outstanding concerns, have they been finalized? So for example, we might have disagreement between the parties in a construction contract. Or perhaps even thinking about things such as, what about on all change orders? Because we are now changing the contract and the terms of the contract through change orders. And has there been a solution acceptance, which gets back to any comments, observations, or outstanding concerns? And sometimes it may even be deemed regarding the start date and the reported end completion date. Again, these are some of the issues that can be involved with a project and a project sign-off. I mentioned the word BCIN at some point in this presentation, and I wanted to explain a little bit about the BCIN. Well, the BCIN is unique to Ontario. So Building Code Identification Number is what is referred to, that acronym. It's a unique number required on all drawings submitted for a building permit in Ontario, Canada. It may also be used when corresponding with the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing regarding any building-related work that may require a qualified firm or a designer. So the purpose of the BCIN is to ensure that construction in Ontario, Canada is safe and up to code. These professionals and businesses must also show proof of insurance. So for example, they must carry liability and certainly errors and omission insurance. Additionally, there's an annual fee and a re-registration is required every year. So when we talk about this, the Building Code Act, actually of 2002 under Bill 124 in Ontario, required that a range of individuals and firms must be responsible for any design activities, including even housing. So this is kind of unique compared to most of the other provinces and territories. And certainly it was designed to protect the actual build process and who was actually doing drawings. As we know, there's sort of the old proverbial story about maybe a design could be put together over lunch on the back of a paper napkin or something. And that would maybe also qualify back in the days, long time ago, to get a building permit. Well, I guess that came to a screeching halt with this Bill 124 in 2002. So these individuals must be registered within the province and approved. So architects and engineers are not required to actually do any projects less than 600 meters square, roughly 6,400 square feet. So in this case, a individual or business, or an individual being someone probably with architectural background that's completed post-secondary education and so on, can apply not just to be recognized just as an architect, but actually as a building code, we'll call it designer. For most residential small commercial projects, you do not need an architect or an engineer in this case. So this fills a different, unique sort of, we'll call it niche within the architectural and engineering field. Now, certainly they can't practice engineering, but they certainly can practice architecture and do drawings for things such as houses. So again, the keyword qualified individuals, certain drafting service courses that they had to complete to become a BCIN designer. What this basically has done is removed any questionable drawings and design practitioners to ensure stricter compliance for building code and building design. I also wanted to touch a little bit about, sometimes the question comes up, well, what about when we talk about sign-offs and fees and all the work that's required when it comes to architecture, engineering, and certainly the the construction drawings. So I kind of put this slide together to give some example of some sample fees. So some design drawing fees are many times based on a percentage of construction costs. So as an example, an architect design can vary in, we'll say, their fee structure from 5 to 10% of the actual construction costs. So that can amount to literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Of course, there are people that will do what they call the hourly rate construction review of drawings, and that can be in the range of roughly $100 per hour or more. Or what about measured drawings? So for example, we have an existing building and it's going to have an addition. We can see this could range to $2 to $3 per square foot. Or conceptual drawings, basic, we'll call it preliminary designs. Or the construction drawings, actual construction drawings, from roughly $3 to $6 per square foot. Now, these are the people that I refer to are those ones that are like the BCIN designers. So as an example, their fee would be substantially lower than an architect, or in some cases, certainly the engineer. But what if a structural engineer design is required? We can see it could easily start at least $2,000 and certainly significantly more. And when it comes to even issues such as septic systems, $5,000. So again, to kind of give you some general ideas of when we talk about certainly sign-offs in design, drawings, specifications, construction documents, they all kind of fit and tie together. They all have a common thread. On this slide, we're basically indicating, or I am basically indicating, this is from the OAA, the Ontario Association of Architects, their code check. On all drawings that are required now in Ontario, these forms must be completed. So the OAA code check is basically an indication about the building code and what they call a data matrix for part 3 or part 9. So part 3 is large buildings, part 9 is smaller buildings, including housing. There's a list of requirements that must be completed and filled for a set of drawings in Ontario. We use this in the college system. At least I used it with my students, especially in teaching the 3rd year in the program. Getting familiar with how to do these and how to complete them and checking things to make sure that they do meet code. So again, this is a common practice in Ontario for any large project. Let me go to the next slide here. This is one of the actually student projects, one of my student projects from the 3rd year program, in which I had the students basically work on the government office building in downtown Windsor. So you can see the very, very first sheet, which we teach them, is to complete those 3 forms. Okay, so the building code design check. And again, all of this has to be done and completed. We take a look down towards the later on into sort of towards the lower corner down on what I call the title block where my little arrow is. Typically that's where the architect or engineer would officially stamp the drawings. So again, the information would be deemed as completed, as ready, we'll call it, to go out for tender or bid, or for actual construction or for building permit, once those drawings are stamped and approved by the architect, engineer, or in some case, if it was a smaller project, the BCIN designer. When we're talking about this also, one of the other sign-off issues becomes the issue of, are the drawings complete in order to get a building permit? So for example, this slide here is the OBC, Ontario Building Code code check. So in taking the building code courses throughout my career, what we need to know is that during plan examination, there's a number of code checklists. So we can see it's either a checkbox says NIC, not in contract or not included. Okay, it's checked off. Ceiling heights, room and space dimensions. There's a series of 18 code check sheets that can be completed when it comes to any project. So for example, this could be applied to a house or a small building. Likewise, there are code check sheets for part 3 larger buildings. I just wanted to kind of make you familiar with, again, sign-offs and some of the levels of responsibility when it comes to sign-offs. So sign-off is certainly an important topic and probably one not always discussed when we think about the issue of who's signing off and who's taking responsibilities. So again, thank you for your time. I hope I have transferred some information into your minds to think about, or certainly I'm open for comments or questions. Thank you. Hello? Was there any comments or questions? Any last minute before I guess we stop our program? Hello? John? Okay, I guess barring no questions, I guess that's the end of my presentation. So I thank everyone again for attending. Certainly, if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Certainly, we'll be sending out the recording to you shortly. So again, once again, thank you and have a great weekend. Cheers.